payable to creditor by a nation is known as its national debt, which is the accumulation prior deficit. The outstanding debt owed by a nation is referred to as its national debt, federal debt, or public debt. It is typically derived via bonds and other debt securities, although it may also be derived directly from international institutions like the World Bank. The term length of national debt are variable, just like those of other types of debt. The majority of the country's debt has a length duration, and the yield on 10 years federal government bond is widely regarded as the current risk-free rate. The government borrows for a variety of different purposes. For example, tax revenue are less than predicted, automatic fiscal stabilizer, investment, spending commitments, political, war, and real debt burdens often decrease as the economy grows.
Next, the concept of national debt is the amount of money borrowed by the federal government to cover the outstanding balance of expenses incurred. According to the Keynes theory, public debt accumulates when the government is forced to engage in massive deficit spending, where the additional taxes required to pay the interest on the debt. National debt is divided into 4 categories, which are issuer, maturity, repayment method, and holder. Firstly, the issuer originates from several levels of government, which is from federal to municipal. The risk of national debt is determined by the issuer, and the municipal debt carries a larger risk than the federal debt. Next, for the maturity, national debt usually has a long-term maturity of 10 years and has a free risk rate. Following that, the method of repayment, which refers to where the government obtains the funds to repay their debt. The repayment source is derived from taxes collected by the society. Lastly, the holder of national debt can be either citizens or foreigners, with citizens holding the local debt and the foreigners holding the foreign money. Next, literature review. The first article is about debt, budget deficit, and economic growth in Malaysia. According to the article, debt overhang theory helps in explaining on how the debt affects growth through the capital accumulation channel. Debt overhang refers to the huge debt burden that prevents the firm from continuing on the future project since it cannot take on the additional debt. When Malaysia's foreign debt rises, the investors' expectation of return falls and the government's ability to repay the debt will decrease. Malaysia's debt will increase and it can lead to a negative economic growth. Second article is about the relationship between government revenue and government expenditures. In this article, there are 4 hypotheses that can be used to measure the relationship between the government's revenue and expenditure, which are revenue and spend hypothesis, spend and revenue hypothesis, fiscal synchronization hypothesis, and fiscal independence hypothesis. The hypothesis shows whether the government revenue would affect the government expenditures and the economic growth of Malaysia. Third article is about the real effect of government debt on sustainable economic growth in Malaysia. According to the article, the association between government debt and economic growth is weak for GDP proportion less than 90%. The rising trend of government spending leads to a government debt crisis. So, the government will improve the long-term economic growth by increasing the government spending, which will result in increased consumption, increase in the budget deficit, increase in borrowing to finance the deficit, and it will result in an improvement in the level of government debt.
Assalamualaikum, my name is Nohazita binti Ramli. My metric number is 292103. Next is public debt and economic growth in Malaysia. The article is discussed study on the relationship between government spending and economic growth. According to Freeman and Weber 2009, sectors such as education and health can impact long-term economic gains due to increased social well-being. The result, the labor productivity will rise, resulting in rapid economic growth. And aside from that, the article will investigate the link between debt and economic growth. So, the debtor country's economic development will be negative because it will be difficult to get fresh borrowing to pay existing debt and fund new investment. Next is the impact of government debt on economic growth in Malaysia. Government expenditure, according to the article, refer to money spent by the government on goods and services such as transfer payments, public consumption, and investment. According to Pettinger 2019, if the government invests in infrastructure or education and training, aggregate supply will rise, labor productivity will rise, and long-term economic growth will result. The study is demonstrate that there is no clear meaning on the impact of government spending on economic growth. Next is the impact of debt financing on productivity of small and medium scale enterprise. According to the article, correction require cash to begin operation, which they might obtain through internal funds, debt, and stock. Small and medium-sized enterprise SMEs can obtain funds by borrowing from financial institutions, but this can result in the company incurring additional debt. According to Citi 2011, who researched the impact of debt on firms, a moderate debt level promotes welfare and increased growth, whereas a high level can lead to a drop in company growth. For example, because of the negative link between the firm's debt-to ratio and financial performance as measured by the return on asset (ROA) and the return on equity (ROE), the optimal level of capital structure will enable the firm to boost its financial performance.
According to the study, the national debt is divided into three such as official borrowing, medium long-term debt, and short-term debt. Among the highest national debt from category is option borrowing. From the analysis found that the national debt increased from years to years due to several issues. The first issue is higher cost of government spending. This is because the more the economic growth, the more the national debt increase. This is proven. Angel and Dito said the increase in operating expense around an average of 6% contribute to the service and improvement of the country. With this, we can see government spending increasing by 20 billion from 2020 to 2021. So, in order to reduce the national debt, it is necessary to reduce spending of a certain government sector. The second issue is low interest payment. This is because when interest rate are low, the cheaper from the government to run a deficit budget, and this cause the government to accumulate national debt. For example, if government spending multiplied by infrastructure spending is 2, then 100 billion in deficit spending will create 200 billion in overall economic activity. So, when current economic deficit, the government can only carry out operation that can benefit the economy. In conclusion, every through the economy is becoming more stable, the government still have to cover a lot of debt because the debt during the deficit is not paid and can increase for years to years.
Hi and Assalamualaikum. So my name is Nurul Natasha Lia binti Nurkidin, and right now I'm going to continue the presentation with the analysis of the study part. So the government expenditure, whether it is funded by the production of new money or new debt, will boost the purchasing power of particular economic sectors, which ultimately will boost the demand. Growing public debt can also subvert economic expansion indirectly when there is enough ambiguity surrounding how actual debt servicing costs will be distributed through the explicit or implicit transfers mentioned above. Different economic sectors may alter their behavior to protect themselves from having to bear the full burden of the debt. In addition, the quick increase in debt can trigger the deliberate fabrication of fiction and embezzle. This fictitious wealth, whose formation distorts economic activity, may take the form of inflated asset values or the capitalization of costs that are more appropriately expensed. Increasing public debt will cause a financial crisis, which then either forces the economy into debt-driven deflation or bring in a political crisis. When asked to explain why having too much debt is a problem, the majority of the economists will typically respond that debt only becomes an issue when it triggers a financial crisis. This argument is flawed for several reasons, in addition to being completely secular. Government deficits are reflected in changes to the national debt over time. In other terms, a federal government debt is the result of the accumulation of budget deficits, which happen when government expenditure exceeds the revenue. The federal government's debt and budget deficit both have an impact on one another. Move on to the next part. Government expenditures must be financed either by running a deficit and borrowing from the public or by increasing current taxes. The government will eventually need to increase taxes to cover the interest payments in the future if it chooses to run a budget deficit. In other words, whether it is now or in the future, the more the government spends, the greater the taxes will be. The government has two payment options for paying back its debt, which is interest and principal fees. To put it simply, the government must pay the interest fees within the time frame established, and once that time has passed, they must pay the principal fees. It turns out that every time the government has to pay the principal, they just create a new debt to cover the previous one. It can be claimed that all debt, whether domestic or foreign borrowing or both, is used to pay the federal government's deficit. Treasury bills, investment certificates, government guarantees, and other credit instruments are sold under the domestic borrowing because the government's revenue is insufficient to cover its obligation, and this short-term loan can be somewhat helpful. The two types of external debt are markets loan and also projects loans. So that's all from us. Thank you for your time.